A parable is a story or saying that illustrates a truth using comparison, hyperbole, or simile, and these parables usually contain two levels of meaning, being the earthly story and the heavenly meaning. This means that parables can create an image using things known to the audience, like the growing of seeds, to give them an insight on heavenly things, like the coming reign of God. But this is where we run into our first problem. The previous definitions are for the English use of the word parable, whereas the Greek and Hebrew uses are even broader. The English use of parable is to illustrate truth, whereas the Greek and Hebrew can use the word parable as a proverb or a paradox. The Hebrew uses go even further and have their word for parable used as a prophetic poem, a riddle, or even a taunt. The narrower English framework is still rather large, however. As the Dictionary of New Testament Background states, they can range in length from a sentence or two to a short story of a few hundred words. They may make a single point or several points, and lastly, these points may be rather allegorical, or not. It may come as no surprise then, that due to the vague definition, there is no concrete number of parables in the Bible, as it is determined by which definition you hold. That, as well as the repetition of many within the Synoptic Gospels. However, in total, the number of parables told by Jesus seems to range from 40 to 60, depending on the source, and the Old Testament differs depending on the definition. Interestingly, the genre of parables seems to have been well known to the Jews around the time of Jesus' ministry, as Matthew 13:10 says, "Then the disciples came and said to him, 'Why do you speak to them in parables?'" This shows the disciples' understanding of what a parable was, yet also shows their lack of understanding as to why Jesus spoke in parables. If Jesus' own disciples weren't aware of why he used parables, what was the point? Why use parables at all? Jesus used parables as a way to express spiritual truths to people who were willing to hear, and also to conceal the truths from others. Mark 4:10-12 shows Jesus telling his disciples that Jesus is concealing his truth from those who are against him. This verse may indicate that Jesus' intention is that of judgment on those who opposed him, and that he seeks to harden their hearts. This doesn't seem to be the case with all parables, however, as some of the parables were understood very clearly by the audience, such as the case in Matthew 21, where the chief priests and Pharisees understood Jesus was speaking about them. Therefore, the parables likely had different functions depending on the audience. Similarly, Old Testament examples of parables had different functions depending on their audience. This is seen in Numbers, where the use of parables is to convey predictions, or in Ezekiel, where the parables help to pronounce judgment upon the rebellious house. We are now going to look at the types of parables that Jesus spoke. Luckily for us, his uses of parables are not as broad as those in the Old Testament, and can be broken down into three main categories. Similitude. This is the simplest type of parable, as it expresses a familiar experience in a short narrative format. It seeks to connect the familiar experience with a heavenly meaning, such as the parable of the growing seed, through the use of a simile. Here, we can see the use of as to connect the common idea of a man scattering seed to the kingdom of God. The next type is simply called parable. It is longer than a similitude and uses a fictitious story rather than a real-life event. Although these stories are fictitious, they are still vivid to the audience and also compare different things. Here is an example from Luke 8. And the red boxes are here to help indicate the comparison like in the similitudes. Lastly, we have the exemplary story. Again, these contain comparisons between events. However, exemplary stories are different in the way they present their purpose. The previous two types of parables allow the audience to see analogies between earthly things and heavenly meanings, whereas exemplary stories present an example or a principle. There are only 4 examples of this, with those 4 being the rich fool, the rich man and Lazarus, the Good Samaritan, and the Pharisee and the tax collector, all of which appear in the Gospel of Luke. For the final area, we will be looking at principles that can help to understand parables. Firstly, it is important to pick up any repetition within parables, as it emphasizes the major point or points. The parable of the pearl of great price and the parable of the hidden treasure are very similar and seem to be repeating the same meaning using different earthly things. This is purposeful and creates emphasis, in this case on the importance of the kingdom of heaven. Secondly, to identify stock symbolism being used. This means that one use of symbolism can often be repeated through other parables and the whole Bible. An example being that God is often referred to as a king, a father, or a shepherd. Lastly, parables can be understood by looking at the surrounding text. Evidence of why can be found when looking at the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. The parable of the rich man and Lazarus is connected to the preceding as an example, both of a man who was a lover of money and who foolishly made poor use of his possessions, as well as an example of the continued validity of the law and the prophets. So, the surrounding text allows insight into the meaning of parables which are placed purposefully by the author. Other principles also exist, such as looking at the cultural context as well as looking at who the intended audience is. In conclusion, although the definition of the genre of parables is a little fuzzy, we have the tools to understand and unlock the heavenly meaning given to the audience by Jesus.